Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time we're going to look at Linux Mint 22, which has just been released. As I've indicated in the title of this video, Linux Mint is an excellent choice for Windows users. And by this I don't mean that Linux Mint is the same as Windows, nor that it runs Windows software. But if you're a Windows user who's never used Linux, then Linux Mint is a great place to start. So let's go and take a closer look at Linux Mint 22. Well, it's now July the 25th, 2024, and here on the Linux Mint website, Linux Mint 22 has just been released. As we can see, it's codenamed Wilma, and it's an LTS or long-term support release with security updates until 2029. The system requirements are for a 64-bit CPU, along with a minimum of 2 GB of RAM, although 4 GB is recommended. And so, in practice, Linux Mint 22 will run on pretty much any computer made in the last 10 years or so, and it should perform better on less powerful hardware than Windows 10 or Windows 11. To obtain a free copy, we just have to go to Download, where we can click on Look Linux Mint 22 Recommended, very exciting, and we discover on this page there are 3 editions, the Cinnamon Edition, the XFCE Edition, and the Mate Edition, all of which have different desktops. And here, the most popular is the Cinnamon Edition, which is the one we'll mainly focus on in this video. So, let's click on Download, and if we go down this page, we find there are loads and loads of mirror sites that actually provide access to the ISO file. I'm in the UK, so I'm going all the way down to UK, there we are, and I'm going to download from the University of Kent Mirror Service. And so I'll click to save the ISO file, which is 2.7 GB in size. And there we are, our download is complete, very exciting. And here in Windows, I've inserted a USB drive, which has to be at least 4 GB in size, and we're going to run up Balena Etcher, which is free to download from etcher.balena.io. And here we'll select the ISO file we just downloaded, there it is, and we'll check we've selected the right USB drive. There's only one plugged in, has to be the right drive, and we'll click on Flash, which will delete everything from the USB drive. And Windows will just check we want to do it, yes we do, and Etcher will now image a live USB drive that we can use to test and install Linux Mint 22. Right, we're now booting my i5 test rig from the live USB drive we just created, and if you need help booting from a USB drive, I've left some information in the video description. But here we now are at a grub menu that allows us to launch Linux Mint 22, where we'll just press Enter to select the first option, and then use the magic of filmmaking to speed forward in time. And here we are now arriving for the first time in Linux Mint 22, which is running from the USB drive, so if we just want to test it out, we can do so without installing anything on the computer. But here I do want to do an install, so we'll click on the Install Linux Mint icon to launch the installer, where first we need to confirm our language by pressing Continue, and then we confirm our keyboard layout, which for me is English UK. Next, there's an option to install multimedia codecs, third-party codecs, to allow us to play lots of different media files, so we'll do that and continue, which then brings us to this screen on installation type. And here, the main option is to erase disk and install Linux Mint, because there's currently no operating system on my test rig. But if we were working on a computer with Windows installed, this screen would look something like this, with the default option being to install Linux Mint alongside Windows Boot Manager, which would create a dual boot. And I've got a whole video about dual boot options, which I'll link to in the video description. And here, if we wanted to, we could select Erase Disk and install Linux Mint, exactly the same way we can here now on my test rig. So I'm going to click on Install Now, and then on Continue to confirm the changes. And then we just have a few more questions. I confirm my time zone, and then we have to create an account. And to be clear, this is just a local account on this computer. And there we are, that's it. Linux Mint 22 is now being installed. The installer is nice and friendly. It hasn't changed from the previous version of Linux Mint, at least not in terms of user interface, although there is an optimization, because at the end of the install, the files required for languages other than English and any other that's been selected will be deleted to save drive space. And there we are, the installation has completed, so we just need to restart now, and then remove our installation media and press enter. And the system will now reboot, and once again we're arriving in Linux Mint, this time installed on the computer. So I'll just log in, and here we are back on my desktop with a welcome wizard, and there's various things that can be done here, some of which I'll return to later in the video, but the critical one is that if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, and on this computer there is an NVIDIA graphics card, we need to launch the driver manager to install the right drivers for the NVIDIA graphics card. And just to be clear, if you have Intel or AMD graphics, the best drivers will already be installed. But here for NVIDIA, we'll just click on Launch to launch the driver manager, where, as we can see right now, an open source driver is being used rather than a proprietary NVIDIA driver. So we'll go to the recommended NVIDIA driver, click on that, and click on Apply Changes. And because this is Linux, I have to enter my password to authenticate a software install. There we go, and hardly surprisingly, we now need to reboot. And here we are back again, where we have successfully installed Linux Mint 22, including the optimal graphics driver for a system with an NVIDIA GPU. Greetings! Here I am back again for a look around, and the first thing to note is that Linux Mint 22 has no fundamental interface changes. It's certainly not like going from Windows 10 to Windows 11, which was a bit of a shock. Rather, we still by default have a panel a bit like the taskbar in Windows at the bottom of a screen with notifications and icons over here, and we also have a bottom left menu with all of the applications organised into these categories. And so existing Linux Mint users will have no learning curve moving to Linux Mint 22, and Windows users should also find it easy to use. In terms of under-the-hood technology changes, Linux Mint 22 uses Linux kernel 6.8. And this means that Linux Mint 22 has better driver support for modern hardware than earlier versions. It's also now based on Ubuntu 24.04 and, as one consequence, now uses Pipewire rather than Pulse Audio as its default sound server. But sadly, it also means that we're cursed with the new thinner Ubuntu interface fonts. And indeed, if we go down to Preferences and Font Selection, it's very obvious how spindly things now are, especially if we compare to Linux Mint 21. But if a font that's less easy to read is a problem for you, and it certainly is for me, there is a fix which I'll demonstrate later in the video. Unlike Ubuntu 24.04, Linux Mint 22 still uses the X Windows system via Xorg as its default display server. So Wayland has not been adopted, although there is experimental Wayland support. The Cinnamon edition of Linux Mint 22 that we're running here uses the latest version of the Cinnamon desktop, which is 6.2 and which continues to give the user a lot of control. As you may have noticed, since the install, I've made a few scaling changes, including here in font selection. And I've also gone down to the panel and right-clicked and gone to panel settings, where I've made the panel higher using this setting like that, and I've altered some of the icon sizes. And I've also gone into Preferences and Mouse and Touchpad, which is somewhere down here. There it is, where I've set a larger mouse pointer. It's also possible to configure the menu. If we go down and right-click, we can edit menu, as you can see, although given how organised the menu is, there's no massive requirement to do that. And it is interesting to see there's now a new Science menu category. Finally, it's also possible to customise the interface by going down to Preferences and to Themes, which is down the bottom here somewhere. Where is the themes? There it is. And here we've got a lot of choice, including selecting different colors. And if we go to advanced settings, it's possible here to return to a traditional mouse pointer if you feel more comfortable with a pointer that's actually pointed on the end. Lastly, in terms of aesthetics, if we right-click the desktop and select Change Desktop Background, in addition to all the classic Linux Mint desktops, like for example that one, that's very Linux Mint to me, we also have lots of new pictures with Wilma with Linux Mint 22, some of which are very, very nice indeed. There's some beautiful pictures here. Could never decide which one to use. This one's very techy. That's quite wacky, isn't it? And let's go down a bit further. What else we got down here? That's very sort of relaxing. So there's all sorts of different choices of a desktop background. But I think for now, we'll go with these mountains. Linux Mint 22 comes with a useful set of pre-installed applications, quite a few accessories, as we can see, a few graphical apps, internet applications, not least including the Firefox web browser and the Thunderbird email client, LibreOffice, sound and video utilities for playing video and audio, and then various admin tools and lots of preferences, as we saw in the previous part of the video. And if we want to add one of these applications to the panel, it's very easy. For example, if we go to Internet, Thunderbird email, we can just right-click and add to panel, and it appears down here. And if we want to add something to the desktop, just as easy, we could go, for example, to, I don't know, Office, LibreOffice Writer, right-click and add to desktop. And that gives us an icon which we can then click on to launch, in this case, LibreOffice Writer. Next, let's take a look at the Nemo File Manager, which is part of the Cinnamon desktop. I like the Nemo File Manager, not least because we can change the size of the display using the zoom control down here. And we've also got things like multi-tab browsing. We could right-click and open something up in a new tab like that. And if we look in the preferences here, we can see that, as in previous versions of Linux Mint, we can control what we see in right-click menu. So, for example, if you don't want to see the rubbish bin on your menu, you can simply get rid of it. But here in Linux Mint 22, we can also go to Plugins and click here to get to the new Nemo Actions Layout Editor, which gives us even more control of the layout and what's included in Nemo's action menus, which is rather cool. If we want to install a new application, we can go to the Graphical Software Manager, which is here, and which comes up more quickly in Linux Mint 22. And it's important to note that whilst Linux Mint 22 is based on Ubuntu, it doesn't use Canonical's Snap application format, which some people dislike. And for this reason, the version of the Thunderbird email client here in Linux Mint 22 is a deb version now maintained by Linux Mint. Rather than using snaps, this software manager installs debs, including the new Deb 822 format and Flatpaks. And if we look in the settings here, down there, we can see that by default, unverified Flatpaks are now hidden to improve security, which has to be a good thing. And it still leaves loads and loads of applications that can be installed. There's loads of applications here, as you can see, and we've got lots of different categories. We could, for example, go to graphics here and maybe drawing, and we could install, for example, the Inkscape vector drawing program just by clicking there to find Inkscape and clicking on install. And it installs a few other things. That's fine. We just click on continue and enter our password to authenticate the install. And as simple as that, Inkscape has now been installed. And we could launch it from here, but I'm actually going to close that down. I want to go back to the menu, go back to graphics. There we are, we've got Inkscape. I'll launch it from there. This is clearly first run. We'll just click on save and thanks and new document. And there we are, we've installed a piece of software without going near the terminal here in Linux Mint. Right, I said we'd come back to some setup activities, which a notification down here is encouraging us to do. As you can see, it wants us to set up the Timeshift System Restore utility. But before we do this, there's an icon down here on the panel. The little red dot on the shield has been screaming for some time that updates are available. And if we click on it the Update Manager opens and we can see we've got 4 potential updates. And provided we're happy, we can just click on Install Updates, like that, and it'll tell us what they are. We'll click on OK, and it'll ask us to authenticate, and then get on with the update process. And as one of the updates was a kernel update, we now need to reboot, so we will do that. And here we are back again, this time with a fully updated system. We haven't got anything indicated on the shield here, and it tells us the system is up to date. And if any more updates did become available, we would have a red dot and indication down here, and we could repeat what we just did. And it's very important to note that by default, the user is in total control, and Linux Mint will not update automatically, which I think is good. But if you do want to hand over control, you can open up the Update Manager and go to Edit and Preferences like that and go across to Automation. And as you can see here, there is an option to apply updates automatically, which is not something I personally choose to do. As we can see, we also get a warning about turning on System Snapshots if we decide to do this. And this brings us back to the subject of Timeshift, which is a bit like System Restore in Windows. So let's close this down like that, and we'll now launch Timeshift. We've got a little message again telling us about it. There it is. We saw that just before we rebooted. We could launch Timeshift from here, but if you haven't got this coming up, you can also launch it from the menu. We can go to Administration, and down the bottom here is Timeshift. Let's launch it that way, and again, authenticate. And here we are running the Timeshift first run wizard. So we'll just go through and select the defaults, next on the drive to use, we only have one, and then we have to select our snapshot schedule. And in fact, I'm not going to select the defaults here, I'm going to go for weekly snapshots and keep 3 of them. And we'll then click on next again, and this is asking what we want to be included in the snapshot in the equivalent of a system restore point in Windows. And it's going to exclude the root and home directories. So it won't be backing up user files, which is what I think most people want to do. So again, we'll click on next, and the setup is complete, and we can click on finish. And as we can see, snapshots will now be created at selected intervals. And if we want to, we can also manually create a snapshot. I'll just show you that. It's a good thing to do after you've got your system all set up. So we'll click on create. And this will take a bit of time because it has to do everything. After this, snapshots are incremental. And there we are, a snapshot has been created, which we could use to restore the system if we needed to in the future. Well, I promised to show you how to make the interface font as readable as it once was, not spindly as it is here. And the easiest way to do this is just to change the font. If we click on any of the fonts here, we can pick anything from this massive list. And this is an important point because in out-of-the-box Ubuntu, let alone in Windows, you can't easily change the interface font. But let's assume we don't want to do that and we want Linux Mint 22 to use the same interface font as previous versions of Linux Mint. The way we do it is as follows. And in fact, there's various ways you can do it. I'm going to do it without going near the terminal. And first of all, we will go to the software manager like that, and we will search for fonts Ubuntu, and we can find here fonts Ubuntu Classic, which is the old version of the Ubuntu fonts. So let's install that. There we go, that was painless. And the next thing we want to do is to restart, because as you'll see when I click the menu here, things have gone a little bit loopy because we've just changed the font. So let's just do a restart. And here we are back again, and already I can see things are looking correct, although they won't stay that way if we don't lock them. So I'm going to go to Administration and the Synaptic Package Manager, and guess what? We need to authenticate. And here we're going to do a search for fonts Ubuntu, like that. And I'm now going to click on fonts Ubuntu Classic and go to Package and Lock Version. And oh look, it turns red. And just to be safe, I'm also going to do the same thing to fonts Ubuntu. And there we are. We should now have permanently installed the thicker Ubuntu fonts. And let's just take a quick look to remind ourselves what's gone on. We'll go to Preferences and Font Selection. And let's also bring up the file manager as I had previously. You can see it looks so different. This is what it looks like now. This is what it looked like a few moments ago. And let's come back to the new version. It is so much better, and I apologise for not doing this earlier in the video. Right, we've now spent some time exploring Linux Mint 22 Cinnamon Edition, which by default looks like this. But what about the other flavours? Well, the XFCE edition looks like this, as it uses the XFCE 4.18 desktop. XFCE is a more lightweight desktop environment than Cinnamon, and whilst it doesn't support as many features, it should run a little better on less powerful hardware. If we go down to the menu, it of course looks different to the menu in Cinnamon. It is a different desktop after all, although almost all the same applications are pre-installed, with a couple of exceptions. For example, if we run up the file manager, we don't have the Nemo file manager here, we have the Thunar file manager, which of course can be used to achieve the same thing. Moving on, our third flavour looks like this. This is Linux Mint 22 Mate Edition, and yes, it's pronounced Mate after the South American drink. If we go down to the menu, it again looks different to what we saw in XFCE or in Cinnamon, quite different here. Same applications included though, although again we have a different file manager. If we launch it, this is the Kaja file manager. Let's look at help and about. We can see it's Kaja 1.26.3, and this is because the version of the Mate desktop used in Linux Mint 22 is 1.26. And if you're thinking some of the scaling here of the icons, particularly on the panel, isn't quite as good as we saw in Cinnamon, that is true. I've applied scaling here in Mate as I previously did in XFCE and Cinnamon, and you don't have quite as much control of a desktop environment in Mate and XFCE as you do in Cinnamon. And that is why personally I do run the Cinnamon desktop environment, and if you're not quite sure which version of Linux Mint to choose, do go for Cinnamon. But I did think I should show you everything, and so we've now seen the Mate version, the XFCE version, and the Cinnamon version of Linux Mint 22. Linux Mint 22 is a solid update to a popular distro that's great for beginners and which also happens to be my own daily driver. But are you a Linux Mint user? And if so, what do you think about the latest version? Do let us all know down in the comments section. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.